To begin your hand sewing samples, you're going to take an 8-inch by 16-inch piece of fabric, and then with the wrong sides or the technical backs together, fold them in half and press your fabric. Next, using your ruler and making sure that the folded edge of your fabric is at the top of your work, you're going to measure 1.5 inches away from the left corner and continue to use 1.5 inch markings for 4 lines across your fabric. On the 4th line, you're also going to mark 1/4 inch away from the previous line. And then about 1 inch away from the edge of the fabric, go ahead and start marking 1/4 inch notches across the fabric. We're going to be doing 4 hand sewing samples today. If you're interested in doing more, please do so, but we will be doing a running stitch with a Tailors tack, a back stitch, a prick or pick stitch, and then a whip stitch. For the first line, we will begin with our back stitch. If you have your own thread, go ahead and thread the eye of the needle, and if your thread has not been treated yet, you're going to take either Thread Heaven or some sort of beeswax and run your thread through that to treat it. If you already have some silamide, which is pre-treated thread that comes in a container like this, you do not need to treat your thread. For our first sample, we are going to use a single strand, so take one of the tails of your thread and make it so that it is longer than the other, so you'll have one short side and one long side. And then starting from the folded edge of your fabric, we're going to start with a Tailors tack. A Tailors tack is something that you can do and use so that your sewing stays in place without a knot. And the basting stitch or running stitch is used in sewing samples where you want something to temporarily be put in place, but you want to easily take it out. So the first step is about 1 inch away from the edge of your fabric. You're going to put your needle through the front and back of the fabric, come back out through the front, taking about 1/4 to 3/8 of an inch of a bite, and then leave a little bit of a tail, and then go directly back into your original stitch and out the other. That's called a Tailor tack. Next, we're going to do a base stitch or a running stitch, which is the simplest hand stitch that you can do. So first I'm going to go in from the front, and then I'll use my pointer finger to sort of push the needle through from the back side with my non-dominant hand, pull it through. And then you'll just continue this, trying to keep your stitches somewhat even. This stitch is used in tailoring. It's used if you have really slippery fabric that you don't want to or can't pin together, that you need to stay together while you're sewing. And just as a simple general stitch. Okay, now once you get pretty close to the edge, we're going to do that Tailors tack again. So I'm going to go through the fabric, back out again, and then I'll go back into this stitch here and out through the other side. Then you're going to clip your thread at the end, and you have completed your first stitch. Using another or a new set of thread, now we're going to tie a knot, and I'm going to show you 2 different ways to tie a knot. The first way is with both tails together. You're going to wrap the thread around your non-dominant pointer finger, holding it down with your thumb, and wrap it around one rotation like this. Then you will start to roll the thread together roll it off of your finger, and then taking your middle finger and thumb at the top of the knot and your pointer at the bottom, you're going to pull the knot. You'll see that we've created one. Give that a try a few times. If it doesn't work out, that's okay. You can try a different method. And then when you're clipping your thread, make sure that you've got just a little bit, 1/8 of an inch or so below the knot. You don't want to cut too close to the knot, otherwise it won't stick. I'm going to show you another method if that doesn't work. If that method doesn't work, then you're going to create a loop, and then coming from the bottom to the top, you're going to take the tail threads and come through the loop 3 times. And you can pull the knot, and if it's not looking very organized, tug on it this direction and clip your threads. Now we're going to be doing the basting, or the back stitch, and the back stitch is one of the strongest stitches that you can use. So the first thing that you want to do is we are going to hide the tail so that it's on the back side of the fabric. So about 1 inch or so away from the edge, the folded edge of your fabric, come through the fabric so that the knot is on the back side. And then moving from back to front, I'm going to go behind my stitch, and then I'm going to have it so that the thread is in the middle. So I've got one end of my needle here and the other end out here, and then I'm going to pull that through. And then I'm going to continue doing this across, going from the original stitch that I had, spanning the middle thread, like so, and then pulling the stitch through. You're going to repeat this to the end, and it's going to look like this on the front, and then after I do a couple of stitches, I'll show you on the back. It's doubled up. This stitch can be used if you're out in the wilderness and you've ripped a seam and you need something to stick together and make sure that it doesn't fall apart. It's a strong stitch because it has a back stitch each time you're going through the fabric. So this is a really practical stitch to use if you're needing something to stay together. On the back side, you'll see that it's doubled up. Continue to work across the span of the fabric. And if you're starting to see that you're running out of thread, you want to stop when you've got about at least 4 inches of thread left on your tail. Okay, I'm going to have this as my last stitch. And once I've gone through, I'm going to come back down through this stitch here and go to the back side of my work. You can see I got a little bit sloppy on the end here. What we're looking for is a line that's straight there. Now to finish this and to finish most of your hand sewing, I'm going to show you a really awesome trick to make sure that the knot is really close to the base of your fabric. So from where I came out at the back, I'm going to take a little bite of the fabric. So I've just got a few threads of the yarn of the fabric. I can't see it on the other side. It's just on the back side of the fabric. And then I'm going to take my thread and I'm going to wrap it around my needle 3 times before I pull the needle through. Once I've wrapped the needle, I'll pull this out, tug it tight, and then I can clip my thread about 1/8 of an inch away from the edge. And that is the back stitch. The next stitch that we're going to do is my favorite stitch, and it is called a prick or picked stitch. And we're going to use a single thread for this one. So I'm going to start by tying a knot at the bottom of my thread. And then this one I want to be fancy and hidden. So I'm going to put my knot in between the layers, come out from the front, and so my knot is going to be hidden in between the 2 layers of fabric, so I won't see it on the back or the front. Like the back stitch, I'm going to go behind the stitch that I originally did, and then when I come out from the front, I'll be going through all of the layers of the fabric on the back, and I'm just going to take another little pick or prick stitch, go backwards, move my needle in front, and you'll see I just have these teeny tiny little white dots that are coming through. This stitch serves sort of like an invisible hem stitch. It also can be decorative and used on the inside of jackets, but this is a really lovely stitch if you want to have a nice hand finish where it is invisible on the front, but it will be visible on the back. You can use different thicknesses of thread. If you don't want to see it, use a smaller tex thread. If you do want to see it for decorative reasons, you can use a larger thread. Once I get to the end of the work here, I'm going to show you what it looks like on the back and then how to finish this one so that you don't see the thread at all. So on the back you can see I have a row of stitching there, and then I'm going to come down back behind where I just went, so I'm going backwards, but instead of going through all the layers, I'm just going through one. I'll pull that tight, and then just like I did with the back stitch, I'm going to take a little bite out of the thread, or out of the fabric here, and then before I pull my needle all the way through, I'm going to tie the thread or wrap the thread around the needle 3 times and then pull it tight. After that, I will clip my thread, and I'm going to press the lines off of these 3 so that you can see the pick or prick stitch. So you see the tiny little dots there, and if I run my finger across here, I can see that it has sewn, but if you used a like thread, then you wouldn't see that at all. So that is my favorite hand stitch. All right, for our last hand stitch, we're going to be doing a whip stitch. And normally a whip stitch is used to put 2 pieces of fabric together, so it might be a side seam or something that you're trying to emergency fix, but it would be something like this, and then I would do the whip stitch along this edge. But just for getting the motions, we're going to use this as a grid to go through. I'm going to use a single thread again, and I'm going to tie a knot at the bottom of the thread. You can use whatever method works best for you. And then I'm going to be fancy again and hide that knot. So I'm going to go in between the 2 layers, come up from the back onto my first grid, and then I'm going to make sure that I only have 1 thread that is long and 1 that is short. Oh, and this is a good example. I did not make my knot big enough, so it pulled all the way through the fabric. So if that happens, that just means that I need to roll my thread a little bit more so that I've got a larger knot. Now I'm going to go through all of the layers, and going over to my next grid line, I'm going to start from the top line, move down from the bottom. So it's going to look like a vertical line on the back, and it's going to be a diagonal line on the front. You can see there's my original knot. I swapped sides. And then I'm just going to go across the fabric, creating a ladder effect. And this would be a really wide whip stitch. Usually the whip stitch is closer together, but for the sake of getting used to the hand sewing technique, I'm just going to use the grid. Again, you can see on the front, there's the horizontal lines, and on the back, we've got the vertical lines. Whip stitch is often used to finish a lining that has been shut. If it's done by hand, it's used in a lot of mending as well. It's just an easy, fast way to close an opening. If you're really enjoying this and you'd like to learn more hand stitches besides the ones that are required for class, the next ones that I would recommend are a catch or cross stitch, which is used a lot in hemming and theatrical work. The next one I would recommend is a slip stitch, and a slip stitch is a hidden stitch that connects two tunnels of fabric together, so two turned edges of fabric together. That one's very common. And then the last one that I would recommend if you're interested in hand stitching is one that's sort of decorative. It's called a blanket stitch, and it's used on the outside edges of blankets. And it's a really lovely way to finish the raw edge or an edge of a garment. All right, I'm at the end here, and now that I've reached the end, I'm going to make a pretty thread tail again. So I'm going to go through back where my last stitch was, just about a 1/16 of an inch away. And then after I do that, I'm going to take a little bite out of a couple of the yarns from my fabric, wrap the thread around 3 times, pull that through, tug it tight, and then clip my thread tail to about 1/8 of an inch. And I'll give this sample a good press. And you've now completed your hand sewing samples.